In our previous video about ethos, pathos, and logos, we discussed logos, which is evidence paired with reasoning, and how important that is to show what the impacts of the evidence is and why you need evidence paired with reasoning, or it's just your opinion. But what is good reasoning? When you're building an argument using logic and reasoning, how can you go about doing that? What are some good ways to build those arguments? And also, what are some good ways to attack those type of arguments if they're built correctly? Well, that is the subject of this video. All right, so when we talk about reasoning, there's basically four primary types of reasoning. There's some more complex ones, but they're basically all are different versions of these four. Okay, so it's one of these things where if you understand these four, you can make any argument that you need to make. So what are these? Well, the first is reasoning from specific instance. Second one is reasoning from principle. The third one is what's called causal reasoning. And lastly is analogical reasoning. So these are your four primary types of reasoning, four ways of setting up an argument based on good reasoning that you can use to make some type of claim with your evidence. But how does each one of these work? Well, let's look at them individually. So let's start from reasoning from specific instance. Now, this is where you move from, basically, you see the definition here in the slide, but it's basically when you move from some individual examples and say, because something is consistent across these individual examples, we can therefore assume that it is an overarching idea that would apply in most cases, all right? So let's give an example here. So here you see this one. See, it says, my PE course was easy, my roommate's PE course was easy, my brother's PE course was easy, therefore PE courses are easy. You see what they're doing there. They're using three examples. This person's personal experience with PE, their roommate's experience with PE, and their brother's experience with PE, and saying, all of us found it easy, therefore all PE classes are easy, okay? So this is when you take those individual examples and say, because we see this consistently across these number of examples, we can therefore assume it's an overarching rule. Now, I want to make note here. There's ethos, pathos, logos was the first video in this series. This one's the second one. The third and final one in this series is about logical fallacies. And those are errors in logic and reasoning that you can often commit if you're not careful. And so there's a problem here, but we'll talk about it in that video in case you're wondering. Right? So that's how you set up reasoning from specific examples. Have these individual cases, and you say, because a consistent idea, overarching principle. But some guidelines. First, you want to be sure you qualify the arguments when necessary. What does that mean? Well, let's look at that PE example. Okay, yes, all three of those people found PE easy, but maybe let's just say it's a high school PE class, but maybe all three of them were three sport athletes. They were all on the football team, basketball team, and baseball team. Okay, they might find those easy, but if you were like me and in the band and on the debate team, I might find it more difficult. So maybe you might need to say, therefore, PE courses for three sport athletes are easy. So it's not just enough to find a common example. I mean, to find a common principle across examples, you need to be sure you look for other what we call qualifying factors that can also explain why you see those consistently. And you need to be able to reinforce the jump from the specific example to the overarching principle with good evidence, good statistics and testimony. Okay, things that reinforce the idea that this commonality you see across these 3, 4, 5 individual cases is representative of the overall idea, right? You need evidence to prove PE courses are easy, then you can make that jump a lot more effective. Okay, so that's reasoning from specific instance. Take individual cases, and because of a commonality that exists, you say this is an overarching principle idea. Now, kind of the opposite of reasoning from specific instance is reasoning from principle. And basically what happens when you reason from principle is whereas with specific instance, you started with individual cases and then went up to a bigger idea, reasoning from principle is the opposite. You start with some broad overarching principles and you say, if this is true and this is true, therefore we have this. All right? That general idea. Now, how this is structured is you typically have a major principle, a minor principle, and your conclusion. Now, first you have your major premise. And typically you pick an idea most people will accept that's not too confrontational. And then you offer your minor premise. This tends to be the one that people are going to have a little bit of issues with. And so this is where you need a lot of evidence to prove your minor principle true. And then you say, well, because we have this major principle that's true and this minor principle that's true, we reach this conclusion. Okay? Now, sort of the classic example of this is from Socrates, who was affiliated with Aristotle. And you'll see how we go from major principle, minor principle, conclusion. So major principle, all people are mortal. Kind of hard to disagree with that. Minor premise, Socrates is a person. Okay. Therefore, Socrates is mortal. So you see the connection there. If all people are mortal and Socrates is a person, therefore Socrates is mortal. So that's a simple example, but it shows the idea that you're trying to create. All right. Major premise, minor premise, and a conclusion. Now, here's the thing you got to remember here. And the mistake people often make when attacking specifically these type of arguments. Number one, just because you do not like the conclusion does not mean it's incorrect. Sorry. You not liking a conclusion does not in any way, shape, form, or fashion in and of itself invalidate the conclusion. Now, if you don't like the conclusion because you feel one of the major or minor premises is flawed, that's different. But if I say, do you agree with A? Yes. Do you agree with B? Yes. Well, we have A and B, then C. You're like, well, I don't like that. Look, I don't care. You have to find a problem with one of the premises, which is how you attack one of these arguments. And one of the major mistakes people often make is they try to go after the conclusion. Don't go after the conclusion. Take out and attack either the major or minor premise, because if you can show that one of those is incorrect, then the conclusion automatically falls. Okay? So that's how you build that type of reasoning, and that's also how you attack that type of reasoning. Now, next we have causal reasoning. And this is when you want to establish a cause and effect relationship between two things. A happened and B was a result. Example, because that patch of ice was there, I fell and broke my arm. Well, you can see what they're going for there. There was ice, and if it hadn't been for the ice, I wouldn't have fallen, okay? So that's what you're going for here with causal reasoning. Now, here again, what you need to be sure you have evidence of is proving that the result was because of that cause, or at least the majority related to that cause, okay? You can't just assume that because A follows B, A caused B to happen. You can't do that. You need evidence to show that. And when you're attacking this type of argument, that's what you basically do. You try to look for, again, qualifying factors that also played a part, and your job is to show they played a significant part in also determining that outcome. So in this example, so you fell because the ice was there, right? Yeah, that's the only reason why you fell. Yes. Well, if I remember right, weren't you wearing new dress shoes with the really slick bottoms as well? Well, yeah. And weren't you carrying a whole bunch of groceries and you couldn't see well? Well, yeah. And you were also trying to text on your phone at the same time and you weren't really looking where you were going? Well, yeah. Well, sounds to me that the ice might have had a contributing idea, but a lot of other things that you could have had control of also were why you fell. See what I did there? So that's what causal reasoning is. It seeks to find that cause and effect relationship. Now, some guidelines here is, like I just said, do not assume something has only one cause. Very rarely is that actually the case. Often several things are factors in a particular result. Now, to what level they affect the result, that's for what you need evidence for. But look at those other things. And again, you need evidence to prove that cause and effect relationship. You can't just assume that it's there. Okay, you have to have evidence for that. And when building this type of argument, that's where you need to focus your evidence, is proving the cause and effect relationship. Now, that leads us to our last one, which is called analogical reasoning. Now, what this is when you basically compare two cases and you say, you know what, because these cases are so incredibly similar, what was true in the first case is also going to be true in the second case. Okay? And again, there's no fundamental issue with this. It's fine to make this type of argument, but the cases must be essentially alike. And big surprise, proving the essentially alike of the two cases, that's what you need your evidence for. And again, big surprise, that's what you try to disprove if you are attacking an argument like this, all right? So an example of this would be, if you're good at tennis, you'll probably be good at ping pong. Well, you can see the analogical reasoning here. Tennis is a game. There's a net with a round ball, and you hit it with a racket, and you go back and forth. Have the same kind of thing in ping pong. Therefore, they're making this conclusion. Now, if you were going to attack this, you can probably already think of some issues here. Ping pong, yeah, it's got a net and paddles and a ball, but it's a lot faster. The court, if you will, is a lot smaller. Not just the ball, but the racket and the table. And those all could be issues why this won't work. So that's how you could attack that. A common example, if you're a sports fan, you might have run into, is if you've ever watched, for example, the NFL draft, you've probably heard commentators say on the NFL draft, I think this team should recruit so-and-so from this college because they remind me of John Elway. You know, they throw like Elway, they run like Elway, and therefore I think they're going to be just as good. You've probably seen something like that. That's using analogical reasoning. So what are your guidelines here for doing this effectively? First and foremost, you need to have the evidence to prove the cases are essentially alike. And when there are differences, and because you're not going to have a carbon copy, that's not going to happen. The differences that do exist, you need to be able to explain them. Like, yes, there are these differences, but they're not that big of a deal. They're minimal. The similarities are a lot more important to the overall result in case A and B than the differences are between case A and B. So that is analogical reasoning as well as our other types. So again, reasoning from specific instance, reasoning from principle, causal reasoning, and analogical reasoning. And that is how you build those type of arguments, and that is how you attack those type of arguments. So effective reasoning, as I will repeat again, is important because it's what gives your evidence impact. Evidence without reasoning is just facts. You need reasoning to give your impacts. But when you're putting together your reasoning, when you're putting together your argument, you need to be sure you follow those guidelines for whichever one you use and have the evidence to successfully make the jumps that whatever type of reasoning that you are using needs you to do. You do that effectively, and again, you can be a great public speaker who makes very effective arguments.